a whispered song in a velvet lounge, a pianist who played for secrets, and a murder that unraveled the harmony behind high society's most elegant lies. In the heart of Manhattan, where reputations shine brighter than truth, one man sifts through orchids and deception to find the motive hidden beneath the music. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. It was precisely 10 minutes past 9, and Nero Wolfe was halfway through his third glass of beer. For most men, that might sound ordinary, but for Wolfe, it was practically a sacrament. The first glass sharpened his tongue, the second softened his temper, and the third, according to him, restored the balance of civilization. I was at my desk, pretending to make notes on an overdue report, when the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite tap either. It buzzed like a dentist's drill. Wolfe closed his eyes and released a low, volcanic sound that could have melted a lesser man's courage. "Goodwin," he said, his voice coated in reluctant patience. "The world, it seems, insists on disturbing my digestion. Attend to it." I pushed back my chair, grinning. "You could always pretend you're not home." He cracked one eyelid open. "That tactic is reserved for the ignorant and the married. Go." I went. The woman who stood on our stoop could have been an advertisement for lost causes dressed as triumphs. She wore a grey coat, silver gloves that gleamed in the hall light, and the sort of stillness that makes you forget the rest of the city is moving. "Mr. Wolfe?" she asked, her tone balanced on a line between dignity and desperation. "Not yet," I said. "You'll have to settle for the junior partner until he decides whether you're an interruption or a felony." Her eyes, blue-grey, thoughtful, measured me quickly. "You're Mr. Goodwin." That earned her half a point. "You've done your homework. Come in before Manhattan weather changes its mind." She crossed the threshold with that quiet precision some women manage even when they're breaking down. The perfume she carried was faint, like gin and lavender. Expensive, but not careless. Wolfe was still in his chair, monumental and motionless, except for one hand resting on the armrest like a monarch forced to entertain peasants. "Madam," he said without looking up, "you arrive without appointment, at an hour reserved for peace. That is unwise." "I wouldn't come if it weren't urgent." "That is what everyone says before demonstrating it is not." I took the liberty of placing a chair for her. Wolfe shot me a look that suggested I had just invited typhoid fever to supper. But she sat gracefully, silver gloves folded in her lap. "I'll be brief," she said. "My name is Margaret Lane. My brother, Captain Alan Lane, died 2 nights ago." I saw Wolfe's eyelids twitch, not much, but enough to confirm she'd earned another 60 seconds of his time. "He was at the Green Velvet Lounge," she continued. "He'd come back from overseas only 6 months ago. He wasn't well, but he was proud of keeping his composure. He was drinking with friends, an old regiment acquaintance, a journalist, and a woman from the club. They toasted something. I don't know what. He raised his glass, smiled, and before he'd taken his second sip, he was on the floor." Her voice didn't break, but it wavered slightly, like glass under pressure. "The police said it was heart failure," she added. "They were kind enough to tell me that sudden death is common among men who've seen combat. I don't doubt the statistics, Mr. Wolfe, but I doubt the cause." Wolfe made a small sound that could have been sympathy or gas. "And why?" he asked. "Should your doubt interest me?" "Because the police are wrong," she said quietly. "That is not rare," Wolfe replied, closing his eyes. "But it is not my burden to rectify their mediocrity. You are sincere, no doubt, and afflicted, but I am neither coroner nor crusader." He rose slightly, signalling the end of the audience, and reached for his beer glass with the air of a man reclaiming lost paradise. "You must understand," he continued, "the city employs men for precisely this purpose. Inspector Kramer, for instance, an obtuse but adequate functionary. Engage him." The woman's shoulders stiffened. I could see the disappointment hit her like a silent blow, but she didn't plead. Wolfe had already turned toward his chair, and in his world, that was a full stop. When she stood, I moved toward the door, not out of gallantry, but curiosity. She had the kind of composure that made you want to test its limits. "I'm sorry," I told her. "He's a genius, but he's allergic to emotion." She gave a faint, dry smile. "So I've heard." I hesitated, trying to find something more useful to say. "For what it's worth, you don't look like someone chasing shadows." "Maybe," she said, "but I'm the only one left who still believes my brother didn't die by accident." I might have asked more. I wanted to, but Wolfe's voice floated from behind me. "Goodwin." That single word meant enough. She turned to leave, thanked me with a nod, and was halfway through the doorway when she stopped. "There's one more thing," she said softly. Wolfe made an exasperated grunt, but she went on. "The night he died, Alan's wallet was missing. It was silver-bound, a gift from me. Engraved. Impossible to mistake. The police didn't mention it, but the coroner returned it later. They said it was found on him." I frowned. "Found where?" "In his inside coat pocket," she said. "But it wasn't there when they carried him out." For a second, the room thickened with silence. Wolfe turned his head, slowly, precisely, and looked at her. His eyes opened fully now, bright and alert, like a chess master catching the flaw in an opponent's move. "Goodwin," he said, "you may close the door." That was Wolfe for "sit down. Madam, the game has begun." The Green Velvet Lounge sat halfway between a supper club and a conscience. You could tell by the way the light fell, too dim for honesty, too bright for crime. The place had the hush of money pretending to be taste, the kind of joint where a bad marriage and a good martini cost the same. I slipped through the door and let the air greet me, smoke, gin, and perfume fighting for dominance. The band was resting between numbers, which left the clink of glasses as the only rhythm. A waiter brushed past me with a tray balanced like diplomacy, and I caught sight of the bar. Green velvet stools, polished brass rails, and a bartender who could have recited drink orders in Latin if you asked politely. It was a joint that sold forgetfulness by the ounce. Somewhere in the corner, someone was laughing too loudly, and in that sound was all the proof I needed that this was the kind of place where lies wore evening gloves. The bartender had the kind of face that could tell you the time without a clock, steady, expressionless, and absolutely unhelpful. I ordered a ginger ale because Wolfe likes my brain sober, and told him I was looking into the sudden demise of a Mr. Alan Lane. He polished a glass with the moral precision of a man avoiding perjury. "Tragic," he said smoothly. Sat right there, had 2 martinis, then, bang, heart gives out. Doctor said so. "Doctors are wonderful," I told him. "They make mistakes sound official." He didn't blink. The man was calm. No trouble, no quarrel, no strange company, just bad luck. It was too neat. The kind of speech you rehearse in a mirror because someone important told you to. I thanked him, dropped a tip generous enough to look innocent, and leaned on the bar long enough to make him nervous. When a man's story fits too perfectly, it's because he spent all night trimming the edges. The interruption arrived in pearls and champagne bubbles. A woman with too much charm and a man with too much nose for other people's business drifted over, laughing like they owned the air. "Oh, that poor captain," the woman trilled. "I was here that night. Such a scene. He toasted to old debts paid, I think, and then—" Her husband cut in. "No, darling, it was to new beginnings." They bickered over the exact phrasing as though the words mattered. I nodded sagely, letting them tangle their own yarn. Her perfume could have floored a horse, and his grip on her elbow suggested he'd tried. Finally, the woman leaned closer. The poor man had been talking to that journalist boy. What's his name? Said something dreadful about betrayal. "Journalists are always dreadful," I said. "It's in the job description." She laughed, touching my sleeve. "You're wicked." "Occupational hazard," I said, and eased away before the husband remembered jealousy was still fashionable. Behind the bar hung a gallery of smiles, patrons, performers, and polite ghosts. One photograph snagged my attention, a group of regulars raising their glasses, with Captain Lane dead centre, grinning. But where one face should have been, there was only the jagged tear of absence. Freshly made. I pointed a thumb. Renovating the past? The bartender didn't flinch. Private request. Who from? Not my affair. Good philosophy, I said. Keeps the tips steady. I pretended to study the room while my mind chewed on that missing face. Somebody had decided to vanish from memory, and that never happens without reason. The bartender set a new coaster in front of me as if to change the subject. It worked, but only outwardly. Inside, I was still staring at the gap in that photograph and wondering what kind of story you have to tell yourself to justify tearing your own face out of history. He was young, nervous, and trying too hard to look casual, which meant journalist, before he even opened his mouth. He was nursing a whiskey like a man drinking alibis. You were here the night Captain Lane died, I said. You wrote about it. He jumped a little. Well, yes, but just a short column. A human interest angle, you know. Sure, death always interests humans. He tried a smile. He was arguing with someone just before. Something about debts. Wartime debts, he said. I didn't catch it all. He looked furious, then suddenly, he just fell. The story came out too smooth, too careful. His hands shook, but not from guilt, from rehearsal. The way a man sweats before repeating a lie he's memorized. I thanked him, ordered him another drink, and waited. Nervous people talk in spirals, and this one was winding himself tight. When the second drink came, he slipped. It always happens. Truth is allergic to alcohol. You said he was drinking a martini, I reminded him. Was it gin or vodka? Vodka, he said instantly. I smiled. That's funny. The Green Velvet doesn't stock vodka before midnight. House rule. He froze, realizing too late that he'd built his story on someone else's menu. The kind of detail Wolfe would have written in blood across a notebook. I grinned at him, friendly as a snake. Relax. I'm not the police. Just a man who likes precision. He laughed weakly, fumbling for his coat. Maybe I was mistaken. Maybe, I said. Or maybe you just ordered the wrong truth. I bought him another drink anyway. People remember generosity, and it gives them something to feel guilty about later. The bartender was busy with a pair of late arrivals, which suited me fine. I slipped behind the bar with the kind of nonchalance that comes from long practice and good reflexes. One of the glasses from that night still sat on a lower shelf, clean but not polished. The kind of oversight that only happens when someone wants it forgotten. I reached for the swizzle stick resting inside. It was silver-tipped, elegant, and faintly scented with almonds. Now, I'm not a chemist, but I've been around enough corpses to know that almond and cyanide share more than poetic flavour. I tucked the swizzle stick into my pocket, thanked the bartender with a nod he didn't understand, and headed for the door. The air outside hit like a slap, clean, cold, and honest. By the time I reached the corner, I already knew Wolfe would hate the smell of the place, but he'd love the scent of that clue. It was a Thursday morning, and if you ever need proof that Nero Wolfe is the closest thing New York has to a human metronome, that was the day to get it. You'd never have guessed the night before had been interrupted by a woman in silver gloves and a story that smelled like gin and something worse. The kitchen clattered like a proper Französisch orchestra under Fritz's baton. The orchids were misted, and Wolfe, draped in his yellow robe, made his stately descent from the plant rooms, like a pope with dirt under his nails. He took his place behind the desk, opened the morning paper, and proceeded to ignore the outside world with surgical efficiency. I filed a note, answered 2 phone calls, and waited for him to bring up Miss Lane. He didn't. Not a word. He had closed the file in his mind, boxed it, and shelved it. At least that's what he wanted me to think. I've seen his system work before. Seal off the idea, let it ferment behind those shutters he calls eyebrows, and wait for the cork to blow. That cork came loose around the time he reached the editorial page. "Goodwin," he said, without lowering the paper. "Man seeks narcotic refuge from truth. Alcohol is merely the most palatable method. Mankind would rather befuddle the senses than bear clarity. That is not vice. That is cowardice." "Nice," I said. "Is this going to be one of your lectures on moral degeneracy, or are we just warming up for theology over breakfast?" He ignored me, which meant he had at least 2 paragraphs left. "Martinis, bourbon, absinthe, it is not the liquid that corrupts, but the delusion it permits. One does not toast reality. One toasts escape." "You're doing fine," I offered. "Just don't forget to breathe." He laid the paper down with all the grace of a man placing a flag over a grave. Captain Lane did not die from alcohol, but if he drank poison masked by elegance, then he merely followed the natural progression, aestheticized suicide. "You think it was suicide?" I asked. "I think," Wolfe said, reaching for his beer with quiet solemnity, "that when fools speak with conviction, murder follows." I let him take 2 sips before I jabbed. "That's a lovely sermon, but if you're casting judgment on indulgence, you might start with your own sacred beverage." He glanced over the rim of his glass, like a deity contemplating a heretic. "Beer," he said, "is a restorative. It neither obscures thought nor exaggerates sentiment. It is, in essence, a liquid punctuation mark." "That may be," I said, "but your waistline thinks it's a full chapter." He gave me a look I had seen once before, in Prague, on a basilisk statue, and resumed drinking. Silence followed, but not a peaceful one. He was thinking. I could tell by the way his fingers tapped the side of the glass, once every few seconds, like a metronome out of sync. The swizzle stick was still in my inside pocket. I'd waited to bring it out until the morning fog lifted from his head. Wolfe's mind works like an elevator in a department store. It doesn't stop at every floor, but when it does, you'd better be ready. I stood, crossed to the desk, and set it down gently beside his blotter. "What?" he asked, not looking at it. "Is that?" "The last thing Captain Lane stirred before he died." He regarded it as if it were a live eel. Then, reluctantly, he picked it up. 2 fingers, delicate, like a man testing the edge of a dangerous thought. He brought it to his nose, frowned, and leaned back. "Almonds?" "Yeah," I said. "That's what I thought, but not marzipan almonds. The other kind." He didn't reply. He just looked at it again, like a man trying to decide whether a clock was ticking forward or backward. Right on cue, Fritz entered with a napkin over one arm and the day's breakfast menu. He paused when he saw the object in Wolfe's hand. "Forgive me," he said, "but that smells of bitter kernels." Wolfe turned his head. "Of what?" "Apricot pits. Bitter almonds. It's not the same as sweet almond oil. That scent is used in baking, but it's distinct, sharper, like cherry bark." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Cyanogenic glycosides." Fritz blinked. "If you say so, sir." "I do. That scent is not culinary, it is criminal." Fritz retreated, rattled. Wolfe returned his attention to the swizzle stick, as if it had just sprouted fangs. "You acquired this at the lounge?" "Out of a glass under the bar. Forgotten, but not by accident." Wolfe stood, a maneuver he usually reserved for acts of war or indigestion, and walked slowly to the orchid table. He stayed there 5 seconds, not looking at the flowers. When he turned, his eyes had settled into that sharp, detached focus that meant something had breached his inner perimeter. He sat again, rang the desk bell twice, and when I didn't move fast enough, barked, "Sol!" I picked up the phone. Saul Panzer didn't need convincing. He needed clarity. I gave him both. Wolfe dictated with the precision of a lawyer describing a hangman's knot, The swizzle stick was to be delivered, personally, for toxicology analysis. No intermediaries, no delays. Saul was also to begin a discreet inquiry into the late Captain Lane's recent contacts, financial records, and the current whereabouts of the 3 people seated with him at the Green Velvet Lounge. When he finished, I hung up. He didn't look at me. "You may resume your posture, Goodwin." I did, but I wasn't fooled. For all his baritone dismissal and architectural disdain, Wolfe had taken the bait. He'd swallowed it whole, hook to herringbone. When the room settled again and the orchids resumed their silent contemplation, I sat at my desk and pretended to read the reports Wolfe had already decided to ignore. But my eyes weren't on the paper. They were on that silver stick. Wolfe wasn't chasing poison. He was chasing pattern. And if I knew him, and believe me, I do, the trail he was on had less to do with chemistry and more to do with motive. What had she said? That the wallet disappeared, then reappeared. That the glass was raised but never emptied. Somewhere behind those silver gloves, a truth was hiding. And it didn't smell like almonds. It smelled like guilt. Wolfe wasn't smiling when he gave me my marching orders. That wasn't new. What was new was the particular flavour of disapproval he mixed into his tone, something halfway between philosophical disdain and botanical nausea. "You will go," he said, "to the apartment of Miss Benedict. You will engage, observe, and remain sober." "That last part hurts," I said. He didn't flinch. "Observe carefully, but do not partake. The liquor of liars is rarely brewed without consequence." "Should I wear gloves?" He gave me a glare that could have curdled Fritz's béarnaise, and then returned to his orchids as if I had ceased to exist. Which, in his mind, I probably had. So I went. The apartment was on the Upper East Side, with a doorman who looked like he'd bitten into the wrong end of a lemon and kept chewing out of pride. The elevator purred like money, and the hallway smelled faintly of lemon oil and moral compromise. Inside, the scene was lively. Laughter riding too high in the throat, crystal catching the light like nervous glances, and the scent of something expensive trying to cover something rotten. There were 4 of them, just as Wolfe had mapped out. An heiress, a novelist, a jilted fiancé, and the club's co-owner. The man with a past that had never quite stayed in the past. Each held a drink, each wore a smile, and each, in their own way, looked like they were waiting to be caught. The heiress reached me first. Or maybe she was pushed forward by the others, like a pawn they hoped might distract the detective. Her name was Constance Gray, though the press used her full title when talking about charity galas and unpaid jewellery bills. She wore emeralds, like armour, and lipstick, like a dare. "You must be Mr. Goodwin," she said, extending a hand and a smile, both carefully manicured. "Guilty," I replied, "though not of anything recently." She laughed, brittle, pleasant, rehearsed. "I suppose you're here on behalf of Mr. Wolfe." "That's the rumour." "I assure you, Mr. Goodwin, we were all devastated by Alan's death. It was so sudden." "Death has a habit of being impolite," I said. Her smile wobbled for a fraction of a second. I saw it. The flicker behind the eyes. Fear, or maybe guilt, or maybe just the awareness that her story didn't hold up unless you squinted hard. I asked her how well she'd known Captain Lane. "Oh, we were friendly, not close, but fond." "Fondness kills more men than fury," I said. She blinked, laughed again, and moved away, like a boat cutting anchor before the storm hit. The novelist had been watching from a chaise, swirling a brandy snifter like it held the secrets of the universe. His name was Jeremy Trask, and he wrote novels about doomed aristocrats in crumbling estates. His collar was starched, his shoes polished, and his opinion of himself inflated to Zeppelin size. "You don't look like a detective," he said as I approached. "You don't look like a novelist," he grinned. "Touché. Do you always lead with sarcasm?" "Only when the target's broad enough." He laughed. It was theatrical. Everything about him was. "I knew Alan," he said, as if dictating a memoir. "He had charm, poor fellow, but no taste. Always quoting poetry, and badly." "You write poetry?" "I dissect it," he said. "And men like Alan never understood the power of words. They used them like ashtrays." I let him ramble. "Wolfe always said that a man who talks too much writes too little. Or maybe it was the other way around." Either way, Trask couldn't help himself. "I suppose you're here to unravel our little soirée?" he asked. "Something like that." "Well," he said, raising his glass, "good luck. But you'll find nothing here but vanity and old cocktails." "Vanity's always a start," I said. His smirk slipped just a touch, and I saw the moment his tongue outran his caution. She was late, and she knew it. That was part of the performance. The ex-fiancé of the deceased made her entrance in silk and cold perfume, with a cigarette holder that doubled as punctuation. Her name was Violet Hart, and her eyes were the colour of bank vaults. "Am I interrupting?" she said, though it was clear she hoped she was. "Depends," I said. "If this is an encore, we're all ears." She smiled, not at me, but at the club owner, a slow, sharp smile that belonged in a courtroom. "Don't be rude, Violet," Trask said, trying to insert himself. "Jeremy, darling," she purred. "When I want mediocrity, I'll read your latest." Trask flushed, the colour of brandy over ice. I watched her settle into a chair, crossing her legs with deliberate elegance. "I suppose we're being investigated," she said. "No," I said. "That would require badges and warrants. I'm just curious." "Well, Mr. Curious, I haven't seen Alan in weeks, months even. Our engagement ended civilly." She glanced again at the club owner, who had gone still. "Some people," she added, "don't understand the concept of closure." That glance said more than any testimony. Whatever had passed between them hadn't ended with a ring returned, or if it had, something else had taken its place. I filed it away for Wolfe, along with the scent of performance and the whisper of unfinished business. The air in that room had the fizz of champagne and the tension of a chessboard, and someone had just touched a knight. The club's co-owner, Mitchell Crane, had been quiet until then. Too quiet for a man who ran a lounge where secrets came salted around the rim. He had a face like an Art Deco billboard, smooth, polished, and artificially lit. When he finally stood, it was with the elegance of a man who had once sold hooch out of a prayer book and never gotten caught. He raised his glass with theatrical deliberation. "To absent friends," he said, smiling like he meant it. The room quieted, not out of respect, but because nobody was quite sure who he meant, or how many of the absent were better off gone. Trask looked into his brandy like it had started giving advice. The heiress's hand tensed around her coupe. Violet Hart's laugh was a shade too quick, too sharp. We all drank. I sipped soda. But the silence afterward lingered like smoke that didn't want to leave. It wasn't the words that made the room pause. It was the weight in them. Something Crane had meant to say, but left unsaid, and that something landed with a thud no crystal could cushion. I hate silences like that. They make me want to test the floorboards. So I did. I turned to Constance Gray with a grin that didn't reach my eyes. Funny thing about loyalty, it always looks better in a dress than in court. She blinked at me. "Excuse me?" "Alan Lane. He trusted someone at this very table, maybe more than one, and now he's not here to toast to anything." Violet narrowed her eyes. "If this is some form of interrogation, I suggest you pick a less charming tie." "It's not an interrogation," I said, still smiling. "It's just a friendly reminder that money talks. And so does silence." That got Crane's attention. He cocked his head like a man listening for the sound of future trouble. "We all answered the police, Mr. Goodwin." "Sure, and now you're answering me. That's the problem." The air tightened. Glasses clinked, but not in unison. Jeremy Trask rose halfway, then thought better of it. "If you're implying—" "I never imply," I said. "I ask. And if I don't get answers, Mr. Wolfe gets interested. You wouldn't want that. Crane's smile turned chilly. Careful, Goodwin. You're not holding any cards here. No, I said, but I know which ones you're hiding. The tension didn't break, but it cracked, just enough for someone to spill later. People always leave parties in reverse order of guilt. Violet swept out first, murmuring something about forgetting her cigarette case but not bothering to retrieve it. Trask followed with the slouch of a man who knew how to exit before the applause stopped. Crane lingered, as expected. He moved to refill his drink, didn't, then joined me at the door like a man about to offer either a handshake or a shove. You've got nerve, he said quietly. And I don't like polite men with nerve. They break things. I shrugged. I try not to, but the china around here's already cracked. He leaned in. There are rules in this town, unwritten ones. Ask too many questions, and you might not like the answers. That's the difference between you and me, I said. I already don't like the answers. That's why I keep asking. His eyes flicked toward the room, then back to me. Wolfe plays with fire. You're his matchstick. He walked off, smooth as silk and twice as slippery. But the chill he left behind didn't come from the door. Back at the brownstone, the mood had resumed its usual pace, slow, deliberate, and rich with the aroma of Fritz's late supper. Wolfe was at his desk, dictating correspondence to no one in particular, and ignoring me with focused precision. I handed him my notes without ceremony. If that crowd was innocent, I'm a ballerina. He didn't glance up. You are not. Then we're agreed. I gave him the rundown. Crane's toast, the socialite tension, Trask's brittle ego, Violet's exit line, and the heiress's tremor under all that polish. Wolfe closed his eyes halfway. You perceive the drama, but not the pattern. There was a pattern. Not yet. But you have offered me a palette. I require contrast. He tapped the armrest, fingers like a ticking clock. Not one of them spoke of Lane without dressing it in varnish. Guilt. Guilt is crude. This is performance. They are invested in the illusion of proximity without the burden of grief. I sat, waiting. After a long silence, he spoke. Goodwin, bring me their vices, not their virtues. Which, translated from Wolfe, meant, now it begins. The morning had started the way I like it. Fritz's soft-boiled eggs timed like a Swiss watch, toast done just shy of golden, and coffee so perfect I was starting to believe in karma. I was mid-chew, contemplating whether the jam leaned more toward cherry or strawberry, when Wolfe's voice came slicing through the brownstone. Archie. I swallowed, barely. In the kitchen. Now. That alone was enough to send a ripple through the metaphysical order. Wolfe in the kitchen was like a whale in a teacup, wrong, rare, and capable of unexpected damage. I pushed back my chair and headed in, already drafting a mental memo to the universe to stop doing this before 9 a.m. What I found was Wolfe looming over Fritz like a bishop inspecting a wine cellar, hands behind his back, eyes narrowed. Fritz's culinary expertise, he announced, is temporarily requisitioned for criminal inquiry. Fritz looked like he'd been asked to sauté evidence. I looked like I wanted my breakfast back. If Fritz had a holy text, it would be butter-stained and bound in crusts. The man revered cuisine the way Wolfe revered orchids, devoutly and without room for debate. But now, faced with the prospect of mixing martinis before noon in the name of science, he was balancing pride with personal insult. Mr. Wolfe, he said, fetching a cut-glass bottle of Plymouth gin. A proper martini is not merely alcohol. It is balance, coldness, botanical depth, and just enough vermouth to flirt, never marry. Wolfe, of course, nodded with gravity. And the bitterness. Fritz raised a finger. Bitterness is finesse. One drop too much, it betrays the palate. One drop too little, it is weak. The precision is surgical. Wolfe's eyes gleamed like he'd found a fellow surgeon. Interesting, he said. So even perfection by its nature can be the ideal mask for corruption. Fritz blinked. If one is diabolical enough, yes. I leaned against the doorway. Gentlemen, I came here for eggs, not theological cocktails. They ignored me. I was used to it. Back in his element, which, mind you, was not the kitchen but the orbit of ideas, Wolfe began to muse, pacing in short, deliberate lines while Fritz readied the tools of intoxication. Cyanide, Wolfe said, is not subtle, but the human tongue is easily deceived. Cloak it in aromatic botanicals, juniper, wormwood, gentian, and the acridity might pass as complexity. You're telling me, I said, someone spiked a cocktail and made murder taste like sophistication. Wolfe lifted a brow. You exaggerate, of course, but in essence, yes. Well, now you're talking like a bartender for the Grim Reaper. That is absurd. No, it's Manhattan. He ignored me again, which was starting to sting. He resumed pacing, murmuring about palate thresholds and bitter masking agents. Me. I was still thinking about my toast, abandoned and now emotionally distant. Eventually, the topic of Wolfe's waistline surfaced, not through insult, but sheer circumference. You know, I said casually, if your mental exercise gets any more vigorous, we'll have to knock out a wall for your next jacket fitting. He didn't dignify that with a scowl. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, what little straightening his structure allowed, and replied with dignity. My mental exertions, he said, far exceed my physical requirements. You, Mr. Goodwin, expend energy to distract from thought. I expend thought to transcend energy. Poetic, I said, but pants still don't lie. Fritz, wisely, kept his eyes on the shaker. The moment passed, but not before Wolfe reached for a chair to observe, lowering himself like a battleship docking. Fritz mixed with ritual precision, a priest of spirits. First, the standard martini, gin, vermouth, stirred, not shaken, because Fritz had standards. Then came the adulterated twin, under Wolfe's close instruction. He added a trace, microscopic, harmless, Wolfe assured him, of the compound they'd been theorizing about. A controlled substance, sourced from a legitimate chemist who had no idea it would end up in a brownstone martini. The result looked the same. Clear, cold, elegant. Fritz sniffed the adulterated one, hesitated, then turned a skeptical eye to Wolfe. I will not taste it. Nor will I, Wolfe replied. Archie. Thanks, I said, but I prefer my poison the old-fashioned way, divorce court. We stood in silence, all three men gazing at a glass that might as well have held a loaded gun. And just like that, the joke started to wilt. It was the phone that broke the spell, not a metaphor, but the real deal. I moved to the office and picked up. Yeah? Saul here. His voice was dry, clipped. I've got your lab result. I clicked the pen on my desk. Lay it on me. There were cyanide traces in the cocktail garnish, maraschino cherry, to be exact. I blinked. You sure? Chemical match to what Wolfe sent. Someone doctored a drink all right, and they did it with flair. I thanked him and hung up. When I turned, Wolfe was already looking at me from the kitchen doorway. He hadn't heard Saul, but somehow he knew. I repeated the findings. Wolfe didn't nod, didn't smirk. He just stared at the martini glass like it had insulted him personally. All this, he murmured, to serve elegance with extinction. There was no satisfaction in his voice, only something flatter, darker. Fritz quietly packed away the shaker. Wolfe lowered himself into his office chair with a weariness he rarely allowed and said nothing. I stood with the phone in my hand, the dial tone humming like a mosquito that didn't know when to quit. We had confirmation. We had theory made fact. But for once, even Wolfe's humour had evaporated, like vermouth over ice. The paper hit the table with a plop that startled Fritz more than it did Wolfe. I'd barely unfolded it when the headline jumped up and did a tap dance on my frontal lobe. Nero Wolfe, Brains behind the cocktail killer. It wasn't subtle. The subtitle wasn't shy either. Exclusive, mystery recluse linked to lounge deaths. I glanced across the table. Wolfe, halfway through his eggs and corned beef hash, didn't look up. The Times could have declared war on Montenegro, and he wouldn't have paused between bites. "Did you see this?" I ventured, flicking the paper. "No." He cut his eggs with autopsy precision. "And I have no intention of doing so until I have. Digested. Page 1. Top left. Your name next to a gin glass." His fork paused mid-air. "Pfui," he muttered, and resumed. Apparently, murder and mayonnaise weren't to be mixed before 10, but the headline wasn't going anywhere, and neither were the consequences. The doorbell rang like it had just lost its patience. Fritz had barely turned the knob when Inspector Kramer stormed in, flapping the Gazette like a man who'd been personally libeled. "This is your idea of subtlety?" he barked. "You leak half a theory to some ink-stained gossip hound, and now I've got a 3-ring circus on my doorstep." Wolfe didn't rise. Why disturb tradition? He dabbed his mouth with a napkin and gestured with imperial disinterest. "Sit, Inspector. You're moist with indignation." "Don't you start with the lip. There are reporters crawling up the precinct walls like termites, asking if the great Nero Wolfe is accusing socialites of shaking cyanide instead of vermouth." I helpfully offered him a chair and a handkerchief, neither of which he took. Wolfe finally lifted the paper, eyed the headline, and let it drop like something that smelled off. "I have issued no statement," he said. "Any inference is the press's own invention, or perhaps yours." Kramer's face tightened like a bar rag. The gauntlet had been picked up. What followed was less conversation and more a duel. One fought with vocabulary instead of sabres. Wolfe, leaning back in his chair like a magistrate with no court to impress, responded to Kramer's accusations with a tone so calm it was infuriating. "You've turned this case into a parlor trick," Kramer accused. "You sit here sipping beer while a real investigation is being smothered under column inches and cocktail gossip." "I," Wolfe said, folding his hands on his considerable middle, "sit here, Inspector, because the facts are here, not in your precinct's infernal paper trail." "Oh, you'd like that," Kramer sneered. "Turn this into another of your bloody showcases. Make it all about your ego." "Your projection, not mine. I require truth, not theatrics." The air crackled. If Wolfe had said touché, it wouldn't have been out of place. But instead, he reached for his glass and took a deliberate sip of beer, which had the same effect. "I'll tell you this," Kramer growled. "If this media circus screws up my arrest, I'll hold you personally responsible." "I shall bear it as lightly as your logic," Wolfe replied. And then they both just stared. There are moments when a guy has to decide if he wants to be a bystander or a bouncer. I picked bouncer. "Gentlemen," I said, holding both hands up like a man who's seen enough table clearing in his day. "I'm all for a healthy exchange of insults, but homicide doesn't wait for applause or witty repartee." Neither of them laughed. Wolfe sniffed. Kramer folded his arms tighter. "Look," I said, "this case already has a lounge singer, a toxic Martini, and now a headline fit for pulp fiction. Can we get back to the part where someone died?" Kramer didn't answer, but he did uncoil a little. Wolfe, for his part, merely arched a brow and waited. I had a feeling the main act hadn't started yet. "Fine," Kramer muttered. "You want substance? You got it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a sheet of paper that looked too crisp to be good news. Whatever it wasn't dessert. "She's dead," Kramer said flatly, dropping the paper onto Wolfe's table. I stepped forward. Typed lines stared back at me like a confession left in a typewriter, and not a very poetic one. "I can no longer live with what I've done. It was me. I poisoned the drink. Forgive me." "She?" Wolfe asked. "Clara Redburn, heiress, friend of the first victim, the brunette in the green velvet. Remember her, Goodwin?" I did. She'd smirked like she knew more than she said, and danced like she didn't need to explain it. Now, She was a body with a paper trail. Barbiturate overdose, Kramer said. Empty bottle on the nightstand. This was on her typewriter. Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. He looked like a man who'd just bitten into something bitter. She wasn't on our list of prime suspects, I said. No, Wolfe murmured, because she was playing a different game. Looks like the game's over. Kramer grunted. Don't be so sure. I've seen guilt work faster than justice, but I'll take a confession when I get one. Wolfe said nothing, but his silence felt like a thunderhead waiting to split. Wolfe finally stirred, lifting his eyelids the way most men lift manhole covers, reluctantly. Inspector, he said, a confession is a remarkably convenient thing, especially when the alleged culprit is no longer available to be cross-examined. Kramer's jaw twitched. You think she didn't do it? I think she did not write that note. It was typed in her apartment, on her typewriter. Indeed, an excellent place for someone else to leave it. Kramer stepped forward. You've got no proof of that. I have reason. Proof is your province. That jab landed square. Wolfe leaned back again, folding his hands like a man preparing to watch someone else's house burn. Suicide, he continued, is often a coward's alibi for someone else's crime, especially when it tidily closes a file you no longer wish to keep open. You think I want it closed? No, Wolfe said, but someone does. The words hung in the air, bitter as oversteeped tea. Kramer took his coat and left. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the orchid pots. Wolfe didn't flinch. He just stared at the confession note like it owed him rent. I watched him. I've known Wolfe long enough to tell when his stillness is just gravity, and when it's pressure. Want me to check the suicide scene? I asked. He didn't respond, just tapped a finger once on the armrest. Truth be told, I didn't like this one. It had all the marks of closure, neat, final, dull as a sealed envelope, and none of the flavor Wolfe respected. And if he wasn't moving, it meant the gears were grinding. He finally spoke. We must assume, Archie, that someone has just closed a chapter they didn't write. That was Wolfe for, we're not done. I turned and reached for the phone. Somewhere out there, someone had typed a lie and signed it in blood. The apartment was on the Upper East Side, the kind of place where silk curtains managed to look smug. I let myself in with the courtesy of a warrant and the charm of a man who didn't need one. The doorman had recognized my face from some headline and waved me through like I was delivering a monologue to Walter Winchell. Inside, the suite looked like a photographer had set it up for a magazine spread titled Tragic, Heiress at Rest. The perfume lingered a little too long. The pill bottle sat at a slant too precise. The note, unsigned, typed, single-spaced, lay like a monologue that had never been spoken. I've seen messy deaths. Real ones are sloppy. They have smudges and second thoughts. This one had symmetry. I scanned the vanity, the ashtray, the wastebasket. Not a tissue out of place. Not a lipstick smudge on the glass. Not a single broken thing. Except the story. It didn't look like despair. It looked like decor. The maid was named Elma, and she spoke in a hush that made you lean in even when you didn't want to. I shouldn't say anything, she began, which is servant code for I'm about to spill it all. I nodded like a therapist with a notebook. It was the night before, she said. I was putting away glasses in the dining nook. Miss Clara had company, a man. Tall, short, stocky, thin. Elbow patches, tan coat, smelled like cologne and money. That narrowed it down to half the Upper East. They were arguing, she said. Not loud, but sharp, like they wanted to scream but couldn't let it out. Who started it? She did. Said something about a setup, and you promised. He laughed, but not nice. Said something like, better one clean ending than 1,000 questions. Then he turned up the music. Elma, I said, if you were trying not to be noticed, you're a lousy spy, but you're a very helpful witness. She folded the dish towel tighter. I didn't want her to die, she whispered. But I think someone wanted it to look like she did. So did I. I took another look at the note. This time, not for meaning, for residue. Clara's suicide letter had the flavour of a C-list confession, melodrama without signature, remorse without tremble. But what got me wasn't what it said. It was what it didn't leave behind. No thumbprint. No pressure dents from earlier drafts. No crumpled versions in the bin. The paper tray was full, the ribbon fresh, the keys barely touched. The desk looked like it had posed for an etiquette book. Suicides aren't known for polish. If Clara had really written those words, she did it without sweating, hesitating, or breathing hard. And if you believe that, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn. I'll sell you with change from your ashtray. I held the note to the light. Smooth, unwrinkled, flat as a liar's pulse. Whatever Clara Redburn might have confessed, it hadn't come from these keys. And it hadn't come in panic. It had been composed. Not in grief, but in calculation. And whoever typed it had washed their hands, and their conscience, clean. When Saul Panzer shows up with a smirk, it means someone else is about to lose one. He dropped into the red chair like a man who'd earned his upholstery. "Got your paper trail," he said. "Talk to me." The note, same stock used by a certain ink-stained columnist, bought from the firm. Stationery shop on West 73rd, custom ream, watermarked. Guess who made the purchase last Tuesday? Don't keep me in suspense. Douglas Kent, press credentials, reputation, and a tendency to type with gloves on. Saul handed me the receipts and a magnified comparison of typing samples. The capital E's had a distinctive slant, and the journalist's machine had a stutter in the M key. The suicide note matched both like a guilty handshake. "He typed it?" I asked. "Typed it, folded it, planted it," Saul said, "and probably rehearsed a eulogy while he was at it." I tapped the folder against my palm. Wolfe always said, "The man who fakes sorrow leaves fingerprints in haste. The man who fakes evidence leaves none at all." Looks like Kent had studied both. Douglas Kent had the kind of handshake that said, "I write to destroy, not to touch." We met at a corner booth in a cafe where irony passed for decorum. "I wanted to talk," I told him. "No fuss, just words." He nodded, polite as poison. "So, Clara Redburn," I began. "Close friend, professional contact, convenient tragedy." His smile faltered. "It's awful, isn't it? I admired her." "From a distance?" "From several." I slid the photo of the typed note across the table. He stared at it like it had teeth. "Looks familiar?" I asked. "No. Your typewriter thinks otherwise. And your favourite stationery store just confirmed your shopping habits." His hands fidgeted with the spoon. Stirred the coffee clockwise. Classic tell, trying to unwind time. "She asked me to help," he said. "With her suicide?" "No, I wrote something for her. A letter she never sent. Maybe she used it, I don't know." "Douglas," I said, "when people panic, they lie fast. You're lying slow. That's worse." He looked away. Guilt trembles, but fear sweats in silence. Back at the brownstone, I laid the pieces out like a poker hand. Wolfe didn't move from the chair, but his mind had clearly shuffled the deck twice already. "Kent?" he asked. Cornered and quivering. "Excellent." He closed his eyes. "Now, attend." This began with a death, a poisoned toast at a fashionable lounge. A woman dies, champagne laced, no apparent motive. Then the heiress confesses. Indeed, a tidy confession, too tidy. "And typed by Kent," I added. "Precisely. Clara Redburn did not kill the singer. She was killed, slowly, symbolically, with reputation and narrative. The confession is an exoneration in disguise. For Kent? For someone else?" He opened his eyes. They were glassy, but sharp. "Someone paid Kent to write that note, to close the circle with a neat bow. Clara dies with guilt. The first murder fades. The club's reputation is salvaged." I paused. "You think this was about image?" "I think," Wolfe said. It was about control, of truth, of memory, of consequence. He reached for a beer. Archie, assemble the suspects. That's going to be a full lounge. Good, let them drink. We shall serve clarity. And believe me, it would be chilled and unsweetened. We had them all in the office, club co-owner, Kent the journalist, a PR agent, even Elmer perched nervously near the Globe bar. Wolfe didn't rise. He rarely did for guests who wore cologne heavier than conscience. He began slowly. The first death was theatrical, a performance in a glass. The second, an echo composed by a hired pen, both intended to obscure, not reveal. He glanced at Kent, who suddenly had the posture of a child in a headmaster's office. A false confession was authored, not out of compassion nor greed, but for the preservation of image. An heiress was cast as a murderer. A narrative was sold. The club co-owner shifted. His tan jacket seemed suddenly smaller. You, Wolfe said softly, orchestrated both deaths, one by poison, the other by pressure. Clara threatened exposure. You offered an exit. Kent delivered the prose, and the papers printed redemption. No proof, the man said, lips tight. On the contrary, Wolfe replied. Only proof. The typewriter, the maid's ear, the fingerprints missing where they should exist and present where they shouldn't. He leaned back. Vanity, gentlemen, is a powerful motive, especially when truth is bad for business. Outside, I heard traffic shift, like the city exhaled. Inside, silence had never sounded so precise. There's a particular hush in the plant rooms of the brownstone that no subway rumble or taxi horn has ever dared violate. At 9:30 sharp, I stood in the doorway, watching Wolfe's silhouette tilt delicately toward a dendrobium whose blossoms were as white as denial. You could have mistaken the man for a florist priest. Incense swapped for pollen, ritual for routine. The orchids were behaving better than our suspects, I'll say that. No false alibis among those petals, no whispered motives hiding in their stems. Just pure bred beauty, without apology. Wolfe hummed low in his throat, the kind of note he reserved for prize blooms and decanted beer. I knew better than to speak while he was communing with chlorophyll, but that didn't stop my mind from replaying the script. A poisoned toast, a staged confession, and a missing journalist who'd started looking guiltier the longer he stayed. Vanished. I cleared my throat once. Wolfe didn't glance over, but I caught the faintest flicker in his left eyebrow. Even the orchids, I suspected, weren't immune to the stink of lies. Back in the office, with orchids left to their peace and Fritz safely in the kitchen engineering eggs a la Wolfe, the big man settled into his chair and began his sermon. Orchids, Wolfe said, lacing his fingers across his stomach, exist in total fidelity to their nature. They do not deceive. Their appearance is not camouflage. It is essence. Humans, contrariwise, have mastered the art of performance. I raised my eyebrows helpfully, which he ignored. It is not merely a proclivity, Archie. It is compulsion. One must not only lie, but also appear as if one has never needed to. The social compact demands a facade so polished that its reflection blinds even the liar. He paused to reach for his glass, sipped the morning beer Fritz had poured him, then resumed with a scholar's sneer. This woman, Miss Delora, she died not to conceal a crime, but to preserve a fiction, the fiction of noble regret. The suicide was staged, the note typed with a journalist's precision. It was not a confession, it was a press release. I whistled low. You're saying she died for appearances? No. I am saying, Wolfe corrected, she died as one. I admit, Wolfe's philosophizing usually washes over me like background radio. Pleasant in tone, useless in content. But this time I leaned in, because if we were handing out medals for hypocrisy, the world would run out of ribbon. Okay, I said. Let's say you're right. Maybe everyone's living a lie. But isn't that what keeps the gears turning? A little polish on the truth, A little powder on the blemish. It's what lets people shake hands and say, "How do you do?" without mentioning they hate each other's guts. Wolfe tilted his chin toward me like I'd tracked mud onto his Persian rug. "Your argument," he said dryly, "is that deceit lubricates civility." "Sure, or at least keeps the screaming down." He harumphed, the Wolfian form of disgust. "That is like calling cyanide a flavor enhancer. A poison in a silver flask is no less fatal." I reached for my notebook, more to busy my hands than anything else. "All right, Socrates, I'll write that one down. Maybe embroider it on a pillow." He grunted again. "Please don't." Wolfe stared into his glass like it held the wisdom of the ages, or at least a decent metaphor. "Consider," he said, "the gesture of the final drink." "Which one?" I asked. "The one with the poison or the one with the press coverage?" He ignored me. "A martini, carefully poured. A toast, theatrically raised. It was a ritual, not for despair, but for legacy." I settled into my chair, since I knew better than to interrupt a Wolfe in full metaphor. "She did not weep. She staged," he continued. "She curated a moral tableau. The last martini was not a drink. It was an epitaph. A performative act, curated remorse, gilded guilt. She drank not to die, but to be remembered." Preferably in italics, I added. "Front page, below the fold." He nodded once. "Precisely." It struck me, as these things sometimes do, that Wolfe wasn't angry about the crime so much as the amateur theatre of it, a murder he could dissect. But melodrama? That offended his logic. "People lie," I said. "They dress it, are up in love or loss or art. You're just mad they do it badly." "I am mad," he corrected, "that they pretend it is virtue." The air had gone philosophical enough to require a second beer, which I was halfway to fetching when Fritz's knock interrupted the ambience. "Excuse me, sir," he said, holding the office door like it was shielding him from a bomb. "Mr. Panzer is on the line." That snapped the starch out of Wolfe's languor. "Put him through." I picked up the extension and took the call. "Yes, all." His voice was quiet and clipped. "He's gone, Archie." I straightened. "Define gone." "Apartment's empty. Typewriter's warm. Coffee half drunk. No sign of struggle. 1 page in the carriage. Fresh ribbon. Draft of an article. He left in a hurry but not panic." I repeated it all for Wolfe, who closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with the look of a man placing the final piece in a 1,000-piece puzzle, only to find it's from a different box. I hung up, already reaching for my coat. Wolfe didn't move, but his voice had dropped an octave. "Archie, fetch the article." I was halfway to the door before he'd finished the sentence. Back in the office, I handed Wolfe the page. He gestured for me to read it aloud. It began like a gossip column and ended like a eulogy. No names, of course, just hints and allegories, enough to make it clear the writer wasn't just confessing knowledge. He was threading a needle between bravery and blackmail. "He writes," I said, "about a woman who lifted a glass not in despair, but in preservation." Wolfe's eyes remained shut, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly on the chair arms. "He says she was the perfect actress, not on the stage, but in the quiet drawing rooms where truth wears a costume and shame serves cocktails." The last line was the clincher. "I have told no lies, but I have hidden truths, and now even my silence is hunted." I folded the page and looked up. Wolfe's expression hadn't changed, but the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. He opened his eyes and said only, "It is time." Wolfe rose. "Now let's be clear. Wolfe rising is not like a man standing. It's like a nation declaring war." He moved to the desk and pressed the intercom. "Fritz, call Mr. Kramer. Inform him I have something of consequence. Ask that he arrive within the hour." "Yes, sir." Wolfe turned to me. "You will retrieve Miss Fielding, the co-owner, and the club pianist. Bring them here." "All three?" He lifted a brow. Yes, the masquerade is over. I reached for my hat, my notepad, and the small thrill that always came when Wolfe stepped out of philosophy and into battle. As I reached the door, he added quietly, Archie. This was not murder in anger. It was murder in opera. Grand, staged, sung in a language no one believes but everyone applauds. Got it, I said. We're taking down a dramatist. No, Wolfe corrected. We are unmasking a coward. And with that, the case of the last Martini, glass, poison, and all its pretty lies, was about to get very real. You don't often see 4 suspects enter a room like they've been summoned to a séance, polite, perfumed, and collectively pretending they hadn't memorized each other's alibis in the taxi over. I stood beside the Globe Bar, arms folded, as they took their seats in the red leather chairs, arranged with Wolfen precision. The singer wore black gloves and a faint tremble. The pianist looked like his conscience was late to rehearsal. The journalist had a sheen of sweat on his temples, though it wasn't warm. And the novelist, well, he smiled like a man accustomed to plot twists, preferably ones he wrote himself. Wolfe hadn't risen. He never did for guests, only adversaries. He regarded them with the same look he'd give a fusarium-infected orchid, part disdain, part diagnosis. That gaze could peel paint. No one spoke. The silence was upholstered in velvet and dread. Finally, Wolfe exhaled through his nose, leaned back, and said, Mr. Goodwin, the door. I closed it behind me. The performance was about to begin, and this was no rehearsal. Wolfe interlaced his fingers and let the quiet hang a few seconds longer. The kind of pause that made people remember every lie they'd told since breakfast. I have asked you here, he began, not to accuse, but to clarify. I am, regrettably, not a magistrate. My tools are not subpoenas, but reason. And truth, like gin, must be distilled, carefully, with fire beneath, and patience above. He let that land. I saw the novelist's eyebrow twitch, and the journalist shift a knee. The events of that final night at the Green Velvet Lounge have been retold in such stylized fragments that the original melody is barely audible. A toast, a drink, a death. Each of you contributed a note. I propose we reconstruct the score, not to prosecute, but to understand, because only in understanding do we recover our footing. He turned slightly toward the singer, who had pressed one gloved hand to her collarbone like it might shield her from syntax. You were closest to her in those final moments. Your silence, madam, is not guilt, but I fear it is not innocence either. Shall we begin there? The gloves tightened. So did the room. The singer, Miss Clarice Fallon, once billed as the velvet voice of 52nd Street, opened her mouth like she was about to sing instead of speak. I didn't see her drink it, she said. Only that she smiled. That soft smile she always gave when she knew something the rest of us didn't. Wolfe's voice was almost gentle. You have said previously that she made the toast alone. Clarice nodded. She always did. It was tradition. She'd say something droll, raise her glass, and the rest of us would follow. And what did she say? That night? She hesitated. I don't recall. Madam, Wolfe murmured, you are protecting memory as if it were a museum exhibit. But sentiment, unlike justice, has no claim to permanence. Her eyes flicked to the others. She said, 2 endings, that's all. Just that. Wolfe inclined his head. And then? I sang, just a verse. She liked that. She said it made her feel like we were still young. You sang to soften a farewell. I sang, she whispered, because I couldn't stop her. Wolfe let her sit in the silence. It did more than any accusation could have. The novelist, Barclay Trent, author of Evening's Mask and other masterworks in which no one ever washed a dish, leaned forward with the expression of a man invited to critique someone else's fiction. My statement hasn't changed, he said smoothly. I was by the bar. I saw her pour the drink. I saw her sip it. No one touched it but her. Wolfe eyed him like a spider considers a moth, appreciating the craftsmanship, but unmoved by the flutter. "You observed all this," Wolfe said, "from a distance of 10 feet, across a mirrored column, while adjusting your cufflinks and discussing South American cinema with the pianist." Trent blinked. "I have spoken with Mr. Fielding," Wolfe continued. "He recalls your monologue vividly. He also recalls you turning your back during the toast." "That's absurd," Trent snapped. "I recall what I saw." "No," Wolfe said, soft and cold. "You recall what you wish you had seen. That is the province of novelists, not witnesses." Trent coloured, but said nothing. "Memory," Wolfe said, "is not a lens. It is a brush, and yours has painted fiction." The journalist, Julian, stringer for the New York Ledger and former confidant of the deceased heiress, had kept his posture stiff, his answers curt. But now Wolfe turned to him fully, and the game changed. "Mr. Rourke," Wolfe said, "your article draft, recovered from your apartment, contains phrases nearly identical to the suicide note left by Miss Delora." Rourke swallowed hard. "That coincidence," Wolfe continued, "suggests either clairvoyance or authorship. I do not credit clairvoyance." The man's jaw clenched. "You don't understand. I understand that forgery, even when performed with the intent to honor the dead, remains a trespass." "I didn't mean harm," Rourke blurted. "She asked me to write it weeks ago, a hypothetical, something clean, something that wouldn't leave mud on the family name." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "But then," Rourke added, "when she actually died, it was real, it was awful. I panicked. I copied the draft. I thought it would look better, safer, for her legacy, for me." "For you," Wolfe echoed, and let it hang like a dropped glove. Rourke didn't speak again. He didn't have to. I glanced at Wolfe. His hands rested still, but the battle was half won. The rest would not be gentle. Wolfe didn't rise from his chair. He rarely does, unless you threaten his orchids. But the temperature in the room dropped a notch when he opened his mouth. He folded his hands on his girth and gave them the look of a man about to read their obituaries, slowly and in alphabetical order. "The sequence," he said, "is everything." He didn't look at a single one of them. Not the trembling soprano, not the novelist who had suddenly developed a fascination with the carpet, not even the club owner who was wiping his forehead with the same linen napkin he'd used at lunch. Wolfe's eyes were fixed on the edge of his desk, as though the facts were lined up there like chess pieces. The bottle of brandy was opened by Mr. Tarrow at precisely 11:37. Miss Vella handed him the crystal glasses, 6 of them. The first was poured for the victim, Miss Celine. The second, for herself. The rest followed without order. He inhaled. But it was not the contents of the bottle that killed her. It was what was added. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where your polite charade dissolves. The club owner, whose real name had 5 more syllables than anyone needed after a second martini, opened his mouth, and then thought better of it. Wolfe had already swiveled a pink finger in his direction, like a judge selecting who would hang. "There was a minute," Wolfe said mildly, "between the toast and the collapse. A minute unaccounted for. Unless someone would like to tell us what transpired." I glanced around. You could have heard Fritz drop a teaspoon in the kitchen 3 rooms away. The owner cleared his throat. "Perhaps the young lady simply had a weak heart." Wolfe exhaled through his nose. "Yes, and perhaps arsenic has begun growing in the veins of sentimental heiresses for reasons unknown to science." That got him. The man's jaw tightened like a safe dial. Wolfe continued, voice crisp. "War profiteering is an ugly term, but so is betrayal. You needed Celine silent, not dead perhaps, but discredited. The falsified ledgers, the kickbacks in Zurich, the singer's silence, all ingredients of a cocktail you stirred rather too confidently." The man rose halfway from his chair. "You can't—" "I haven't," Wolfe said. "Yet." That left the owner clutching the arms of his chair like they were a lifeboat. Wolfe reached for the manila folder I had slid to his elbow an hour earlier. He opened it with a flick of disdain, the way he might expose a moth-eaten menu at Rusterman's. "I was sent this," he said, anonymously, supposedly the final cocktail recipe used that night, the last serenade. That got a blink from the singer. The novelist looked puzzled. The club owner didn't blink at all. Wolfe adjusted his spectacles. "It includes an unusual garnish, one not visible on the autopsy. Report, but strikingly accurate in its placement and proportion." Now the owner blinked. "I included that false detail," Wolfe said, "to test a hypothesis, that someone involved knew the ingredients not because they were told, but because they prepared it themselves." He dropped the folder shut with a finality that echoed. "No one except the killer could have recognized that forged recipe as genuine." The club owner opened his mouth, closed it. His hand twitched toward his coat, then away. The journalist made a soft noise in his throat. Wolfe nodded at me. "Mr. Goodwin, would you be so obliging as to inform Inspector Kramer that the stage has concluded its final act?" Kramer didn't burst in like a Broadway cop. Too many years, too many headlines. He came in with the weight of paperwork on his shoulders and the aroma of municipal tobacco in his wake. "Which one?" he grunted, eyes sweeping the room like a broom that didn't care what it knocked over. Wolfe gestured lazily at the club owner, who was now the colour of dishwater. "Him," I said helpfully, "and I recommend 2 sets of cuffs, one for the wrists and one for the stories he's likely to tell." Kramer's mustache twitched. He hauled the guy up with a grunt and a practiced twist. "This makes twice in a month, Wolfe. I'd appreciate it if you stuck to orchids and left homicide to the law." Wolfe closed his eyes. "If the law were sufficient, Inspector, I assure you, I would." Kramer snorted. "That a confession?" Wolfe didn't answer. He just tilted his head toward the beer Fritz had brought him 20 minutes ago. Kramer led the club owner out, muttering about theatre people, arsenic, and metaphors. Me? I just made sure no one touched the folder, and that the brandy stayed corked. When the front door closed behind Kramer and company, silence fell like one of those heavy velvet curtains you see at old opera houses, muffling everything, including relief. Wolfe finally took a sip of the beer. He didn't speak. He didn't even glance at me. He was looking at the orchids, and they were the only ones in the room who knew what he was thinking. I leaned on the corner of his desk and let the silence bloom. Outside, Manhattan moved on. Taxis, horns, someone selling chestnuts 3 blocks away. But inside the brownstone, the scent of orchid and justice held court. "Funny thing," I said finally, "how the dead tell stories, even without breath." Wolfe opened one eye. "They do not speak. They leave behind chaos, and it is for others to interpret it." I gave him a lazy salute. "To interpretation, then?" He didn't reply. But if you ask me, in that stillness, something had settled. Not peace, maybe, but balance. And in Wolfe's world, that's as close to a happy ending as anyone gets. You wouldn't know the brownstone had hosted a murderer 3 days earlier. The guest chairs were back in their aligned positions like soldiers waiting for a dress inspection. Wolfe was in his chair behind his desk, dictating correspondence with the same tone he might use for condemning an opera libretto or a 3-star Burgundy. The air was filled with its usual mixture of polished wood, orchid pollen, and Fritz's lunchtime ambitions simmering in the background. It was a return to what Wolfe called equilibrium, not peace, not satisfaction, but the firm belief that, at least for now, the world could be tolerated again. I was at my desk, transcribing notes in a rhythm as familiar as my own heartbeat. No blood, no lies, no toast laced with motive. Just the calm tap of keys and the subtle smugness of a man who had pulled truth from a pile of human debris and gone back to reading Montaigne. At 11:30, the doorbell rang with the kind of urgency that suggested someone had confused us with the fire department. I opened it to reveal a kid in a green jacket 3 sizes too big, and a box so lavish it might have contained a soprano or 2. "Delivery for a Mr. Wolfe," he said, holding out a clipboard with the sort of spelling only Manhattan flower shops can justify. I corrected the vowel, signed with a flourish, and took the box inside. Wolfe raised one eyebrow as I placed the arrangement on the corner of his desk. The orchids, rare, deliberate, and absurdly expensive, were arranged in a pattern that would have made Fritz consider defecting to floristry. "No card," I said, though I already knew. Wolfe grunted. He leaned forward to inspect the petals with the solemnity of a botanist and the cynicism of a man who knew flattery when it bloomed. "From our grateful client," I added, "cashless gratitude in full floral regalia." He sighed, somewhere between irritation and satisfaction. "Gratitude," Wolfe said, "is a counterfeit coin. It cannot be deposited, exchanged, or preserved, and in this instance, it arrives inconveniently late." "True," I allowed, "but the blossoms are punctual." He reached for a petal, examined it with the clinical disinterest he usually reserved for literature or Inspector Kramer's conclusions, then sat back. "A professional renders service," he said. "A professional is remunerated. Sentiment, Mr. Goodwin, is not a currency." I gave the orchids another look. "They smell better than a check and don't bounce. Your levity is unbecoming." "It's not levity, it's post-case resilience. Also, I'd point out that even Julius Caesar accepted laurels." He closed his eyes for a beat. "Caesar," he said, "was murdered." I let that one lie there, smelling faintly of irony and orchid pollen. Wolfe folded his arms like a man who had been sent roses in place of rent and intended to make a note of it, somewhere in his personal ledger of human insufficiencies. By 2 o'clock, the orchids had been relegated to the rear table, the mail had been dealt with, and Wolfe's post-prandial beer ritual had commenced. Fritz brought the chilled glass with the solemnity of a chalice-bearer. I took one myself and joined the master in silence. The foam settled, and so did the air. "Funny thing," I said, after a long pull, "about the aftermath of murder. No sirens, no screaming, just residue." Wolfe didn't open his eyes, but I knew he was listening. "There was a lot of it in this one," I went on. "A son who thought guilt could be arranged like a harmony. A club owner who believed silence was a form of profit. A soprano who could sing truth but not speak it. Vanity," Wolfe murmured, "is rarely silent. Neither is deceit," I said. "It just waits for applause before taking its bow." He lifted his glass slightly, in what might have been acknowledgement or dismissal. It didn't matter. The brownstone was quiet, but the echoes were still arranging themselves in the corners of my mind, reminders that the orchestra had played a dirge, even if no one called it that. I raised my glass, gave it a swirl worthy of a second-rate secret agent, and said, "To truth, shaken, not stirred." Wolfe opened his eyes. "That is nonsense. It's called metaphor. It is called confusion. Truth cannot be shaken without being distorted, nor stirred without contamination. It is a solution, not a suspension. I'll revise it for the press release." He sighed and took another sip. "You're forgetting," I said, "that some of us live in a world where martinis count as philosophy." "You live," he said, "in a world where wit attempts to camouflage disappointment." I let that one settle. It was either a compliment or a diagnosis. Either way, it wasn't wrong. "Still," I said, "truth was served. With a twist." He rolled his eyes, or approximated it with a minimal eyelid movement. "Your analogy deteriorates by the sentence." I clinked my glass softly against his. "To deterioration, then?" Wolfe didn't smile, but he drank, which in his lexicon was practically applause. Wolfe drained the last of his beer, set the glass down with surgical precision, and pronounced, "The human animal is ill-equipped for restraint. Illusion is easier than honesty, excess preferable to discipline." I gave a low whistle. "You planning to inscribe that on a plaque, or just embroider it onto a throw pillow?" He didn't dignify that with an answer, Instead, he turned toward the orchids. They bloom excessively, he said, without purpose, without need, beauty for its own sake, and look how it is misused. That, I said, is the most poetic slander of a flower arrangement I've ever heard. He gave me the look usually reserved for literary critics and insurance adjusters. You're missing the point. Wouldn't be the first time. We sat for a minute, letting it settle. In Wolfe's world, I said finally, even a martini can't stay mixed for long. He winced, which is Wolfe's equivalent of laughter. And just like that, equilibrium was restored. Orchids in bloom, truth extracted, illusion corrected, till the next knock on the door. In the end, it wasn't the music, the martinis, or even the forged recipe that brought the truth to light. It was pride. Pride, dressed in silk and hiding behind toasts and telegrams, finally slipped on its own illusion. Wolfe, as always, found the fault line beneath the performance. And I watched the pieces fall into place like notes in a darker kind of melody. Do you believe the killer truly thought they were justified? Or was it vanity all along? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.